It was 8:15 in the morning, 6th of August 1945, and the world's first operational atomic bomb was dropped above the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It was carried to its target by the United States Army Air Force B-29 bomber Enola Gay, flying from the American Air Base on the Pacific island of Tinian. Little Boy, which was the bomb's nickname, exploded with the equivalent force of over 12 kilotons of TNT. Around 13 square kilometers was reduced to ashes with over 60% of the total building stock destroyed. Within 4 days of the blast, some 120,000 civilian inhabitants had died. Many of them have been instantly vaporized by the explosion. 3 days later, at around 11 a.m. on the 9th of August, another B-29 bomber from Tinian Air Base dropped the second operational atomic bomb. This one was nicknamed Fat Man and had a similar impact to the Hiroshima bomb. Approximately 6.5 square kilometers of the city were laid waste and over 70,000 people were killed as an immediate result of the blast. So what had led to the fateful decision to deploy these new weapons of mass destruction? The war in Europe has ended on 8th of May 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Germany and her remaining European allies. But the war in Far East against Japan continued. Japanese forces fought with fanaticism and with little regard for casualties on either side. The United States and allies were planning for a conventional military defeat of Japan, as they had done previously with Operation Overlord in Europe. The equivalent plan for the Far East was called Operation Downfall. Planners envisaged that their forces would not be ready to begin the operation until November 1945. Downfall would have been the largest military operation of its kind in history if it had taken place. But American and Allied forces were a major concern for the planners. Worst-case scenarios predicting millions of American casualties in dead and wounded. Another problem that had to be taken into account was that some 100,000 Allied personnel were in Japanese hands in prisoner-of-war camps, and it was feared that after the invasion they would all be massacred by their captors. The Operation Downfall would have been far too costly in terms of casualties and military expenses, so an alternative war-winning strategy had to be imposed. And what appeared just on time, this freshly invented and successfully tested weapon, world's first atomic bomb, just offered such solution. In the movie Barefoot Gen or Hadashino Gen, we are introduced to a family living in Hiroshima during the final days of the war as they struggle through daily life. The main character which accompanies us throughout the film is a little boy named Ken. He and his little brother Shinji perfectly portray childish naivety and playfulness as they can always find joy in the little things despite suffering from poverty and hunger. Then there is his father, who is a craftsman and the head of the family, his mother, who is on the verge of giving a birth, and an older sister. The story is interpreted realistically. We see the family gather to enjoy happy moments and struggle through hardships. They are trying to live off the little they have. They go to shelter to cover from bombings. There's even a point where the father gives us an idea of his opinion about the war.
戦争が終わるんか？
時期は終わるじゃろう。この戦争は日本の負けじゃ。
日本の負けならなんでいつまでも続けるんだろ
う。今の国の指導者も間違っとるし、軍部のやつらもどうかしとるんじゃ。
お父ちゃん、そんなこと言うからみんなから非国民って呼ばれるんだろうが。
こうじゃ。わしは非国民じゃ。お父ちゃんはそのことを誇りにしとるんじゃ。こんな人を殺し合う戦争が正しいはずなのじゃろう。
On the other hand, we see the world from a completely different perspective. Humorous, fairy tale-like and joyful seems the world we observe with Gen's child eyes. There are many scenes where reality clashes with childish image. We can see that when, after all the imminent bombings and food shortages, Gen's pregnant mother becomes sick, possibly from stress and malnutrition. So Gen and Shinji decide to steal a carp, as their neighbor tells the boys that this fish could cure her. Carp or koi is actually a symbol of strength and resilience in Japanese culture, so this makes perfect sense. Eventually, they get caught trying to catch the carp. A fisherman punches Gen in the face, but they talk it out, and finally he allows them to take the fish to their mother. This scene ends up being comical and almost surreal. Overall, the film feels optimistic, and with its warm-toned music persistently playing on the background, it's almost lighthearted. However, even if it's invisible, this terrifying ghost haunting our subconscious mind is inevitably going to show itself. Suddenly, the happy tunes stops playing and the story is about to go upside down. And the ghost is none other than the atomic bomb, known as Little Boy, that is about to be dropped on Hiroshima. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allied leaders called on Japan to accept unconditional surrender, or they would act with prompt and destructive force. Japan remained silent and steps were made to drop the bomb on Hiroshima as it was selected as the perfect target, an important economic and military hub. The bomb detonated 600 meters from the ground, triggered by an altimeter at that height. This way, it guaranteed to increase the blast and destroy most of the city. This building, which can be seen in the movie, is known as Genbaku Dome, or Atomic Bomb Dome. It used to be a prefectural industrial promotion hall and was designed by Czech architect Jan Letzel. It was basically in the epicenter of the blast, so everyone inside died instantly, erased by the explosion. But the structure remained standing, with few other buildings left. The sturdy concrete construction served to prevent it from being destroyed in an earthquake, and to this day it stands as a memorial for the dead to remind people of their unforgettable past. Now, let's go back to Gen. Or perhaps should I say Keiji? Keiji Nakazawa was a Japanese manga artist and writer who survived the destruction of Hiroshima. Later in his life, he returned to his memories and wrote a series of manga, Hadashi no Gen. He expressed his stories through Little Gen, who is basically Keiji's own autobiographical interpretation, his alter ego. The manga is the original story that he wrote in 70s and now has been translated to 20 languages and sold more than 10 million copies worldwide. Keiji's work is truly remarkable since he gives his critical opinion about the bombing in Hiroshima, but he also labels pre-war Japan as fascist and obsolete, while other writers try to forget about the war and were celebrating Japan's economical growth at that time. Later, Nakazawa wrote many novels with Gen as a main character. Now, there are plenty of other adaptations like live action films, TV dramas, and most notably the anime Barefoot Gen and its sequel, Barefoot Gen 2. The manga compared to the anime has much bigger anti-war appeal and condemns Japanese atrocities during the war more severely, as the father is openly against the war and the family is hated and harassed by the city because of that. In the film, the family suffers from hunger, but discrimination of that sort is not there. In 2012, manga Barefoot Gen was restricted in the Japanese elementary school libraries after a claim that said Barefoot Gen is ultra-leftist manga that perpetuated lies and instilled defeatist ideology in the minds of young Japanese. Eventually, the restriction was lifted, and Nakazawa's widow, Misayo, added that the war is brutal. It expresses that in pictures, and I want people keep reading it. Now let me show you an interview with Nakazawa where he talks about his personal experience from the Doomsday.
The school gate was right over here, and it used to lead to the railway track. I used to walk along the walls here, and on August the 6th, when I just reached the entrance, just in front of the wall here, my classmate's mother came up to me. When the bomb went off, the wall protected me from the heat ray. My classmate's mother, who was standing only 1 meter away from me, was completely burnt and blown away by the blast. When I came round, I realized I had been blown away with the school wall. If the wall had collapsed on me, my body would have been crushed and I would have died. But a big tree fell in front of the wall and somehow made some room. That saved my life. I had a 6-inch nail stuck in my face, and this is the scar I got from that. It is a miracle I survived.
As Nakazawa retells his memories of the 6th of August, the film follows his story without missing a spot. The fact that this film is based on a true story makes it 100 times more terrifying. And the moment the bomb goes off, Gen is protected by the wall and survives. He doesn't really understand what just happened. Perhaps they finally bombed Hiroshima, he thinks. Moments later, Gen is shocked when he realizes the woman he was with is dead. He runs home quickly, realizing the devastation of his surrounding. No houses left, trees torn from the ground, and the blue sky turned black. He finds dead bodies burned to bone, people with glass shards stuck in their body, burned off skin that is coming right off, and some have eyes poked out, hands stretched before them and are following others to nowhere. I mean, is this what hell looks like? Those were not people, but perhaps demons, ghouls, or modern-day zombies from a nightmare. That's what immediately came to my mind. Yet it was nothing but brutal reality. Those who fled from the fires, or people who had severe burns, begged for water to ease their pain, so some threw themselves into the Hiroshima River, only to drown and die of their injuries. It doesn't end here, and the gory visuals only escalate. Gen finally reaches his home, but everything is on fire. The house is collapsed, and Gen's father, sister, and Shinji are all trapped inside of it. Gen with his mother try to save them but fail and have to leave them behind. I mean, this scene of letting the family burn is seriously traumatizing, since they can't do anything to help them. And as they burn in flames, her reaction perfectly describes the madness one could experience in this desperate situation.
燃える燃えるみんな燃えるお母ちゃんお母ちゃんお母ちゃんしっかりせんかい何をしとるんじゃ
Before his death, Gen's father reminds Gen to take care of his mother and the unborn baby. Shortly after, mother goes into labor and Gen assists her during the birth. She gives birth to a healthy baby girl and they name her Tomoko, which means child with friends. After all these events, the mother condemns the war which killed her husband.
よく見とくんよ。お前のお父ちゃんとお姉ちゃんとお兄ちゃんを殺した戦争の姿。よう見とくんよ。ええね。ええね。
The black rain started falling on the city of Hiroshima as a result of the bomb's impact. Dirt and debris gathered in the atmosphere which later fell on the ground as so-called radioactive rain. Some people who were not exposed to the blast got contaminated by the rain, though it is associated to radiation sickness that soon killed many people surviving the initial bombing. The rain has not been proven lethal. Together they struggle to survive in the ruins of Hiroshima. The baby is hungry, but she cannot provide her with milk, since the mother also suffers from malnutrition. So while Gen goes looking for food on his own, she seeks help from other people. She finds desperate mothers trying to nurse their dead babies, and an infant trying to feed itself while their mother's dead body is helplessly laying on the ground. Mother with a child. It is a universal symbol of love and life, but here this bond is depicted as broken. Gen then roams the devastated city and finds soldiers taking away piles of corpses and people suffering from radiation sickness. In this scene of the film, Gen represents a witness who records everything he encounters, representing what the survivors have lived through. And after things like ladders, grass, or even people that once existed, remain just a blank shadow on charred walls. Animals like defenseless birds with their burnt wings, scorched statues of people that were burned to death in a split second by the enormous heat, or just legs without bodies standing upright, frozen in time. Those who survived had severe burns, maggots devouring their flesh, or people suffering from radiation sickness like vomiting, fever, nausea, diarrhea, abnormal thirst, and delirium. Hibakusha, translated as explosion affected people, were for upcoming decades discriminated by the majority. People thought that they carry some kind of hereditary or contagious disease, even though most hibakusha received only a small dose of radiation, comparable to X-ray. In worst-case scenarios, hibakusha succumbed to different types of cancer or leukemia later in life. To this day, hibakusha and their children are still victims of discrimination due to lack of knowledge about the consequences of radiation sickness. Keiji Nakazawa and his mother were both feared by the public. In 1960s, when Keiji moved to Tokyo to start a career as a manga artist, he was discriminated against as hibakusha. Everybody avoided him for nonsensical reasons, and he realized that many people were poorly educated about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings and its victims. That is one of many reasons why he started writing manga filled with brutal realism. Keiji's intention was to make the audience feel repulsed by the gore, so they would despise the idea of warfare. And after seeing his daughter enjoy watching an atomic bomb being dropped on the city in anime series, Keiji Nakazawa realized how he could attract bigger audience and decided to collaborate with Studio Madhouse on anime version of Barefoot Gen. It is clear that the anime film effectively portrays the nuclear bomb aftermath in Hiroshima City, with not just horrific but realistic images.
ゲン、お前どうしたんねん。大きなハゲ作って。
わしはハゲてなんかおらんぞ。ほんとじゃ。いつの間に。
Gen's hair starts falling out, indicating radiation exposure. Later, they build a shelter out of the remains of their old house. And they also dig out skulls of their dead family members and put them on a shelf as a memorial. I mean, I don't really understand this scene. To me, it's just creepy and completely unnecessary. Although possibly from Japanese perspective, it might be more meaningful, so who am I to judge? After that, the Japanese surrender was still nowhere near. The decision to deploy another A-bomb on Nagasaki was made, and even after another display of catastrophic and destructive force, it took almost another week for Japanese government to agree on capitulation. The Emperor Hirohito played a major role in this situation and is responsible for forcing Japan's leaders to finally accept defeat. So on 15th of August 1945, the war ended without any further Allied military losses, but at huge civilian cost. Eventually, a little orphan boy named Ryuta sneaks into their shelter to steal some rice. Gen and his mother are shocked to find out that he looks just like Shinji. It's a lovely scene where it seems like the lost members of family came back. It is the hope that Ryuta brings that makes everyone happy again. And I understand it as some kind of reincarnation, as if Shinji came back from the ashes. After all, reincarnation is a Buddhist idea that is deeply rooted in Japanese culture, so I don't think I'm far from the truth. Gen feels responsible for the family's well-being, and with Ryuta, they start looking for a job so they can provide food for mother and the baby. A rich man offers them money if they take care of his sick brother. The man is in poor condition, covered with maggots, and unable to move. But after a while of taking care of him, the sick man gets better and even returns to his hobby. They get paid 100 yen and buy lots of milk. So everything seems like it's going very optimistic, right? Gen hurries home, so happy that he got food. However, by the blank stare of Gen's mother's eyes, something is not right. When they finally return home, they found out little Tomoko died from malnutrition. The time stands still just the way it did the second before the bomb went off. It's truly heartbreaking, and if the film hasn't threw you off yet, this scene really puts the final nail in the coffin. Although the explicitity of the severe consequences of the blast and heart-wrenching moments of Gen's family passing away strongly condemn the use of nuclear weapons, the film also neglects the facts of World War II. After all, the film represses Japan's own military crimes. The narrator at the beginning of the movie mentions that the United States are constantly bombing the mainland of Japan and that Japan entered World War II against American and the United Kingdom's allied forces, but forgets to add that Japan basically started the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor. But it doesn't necessarily put Americans in the position of antagonists either. Certain is that Japanese citizens are portrayed as victims of the bomb. Anyway, it feels right to put the film's extreme but still realistic depiction of the aftermath of a nuclear weapon into context with Japan's own military violence in the first half of the 20th century. The adults die or are never mentioned again. For example, the father serves only to inform the audience that he blames the Japanese government and military for the suffering of Japanese citizens. Only the mother is there the whole time, but is she really? She's kind of helpless and doesn't really try much to save her children. All the responsibility is on Gen. He provides food for the family, cares for his mother, tries to save dying soldier and treats the heavily burnt man. The main focus is set on the true victims of war, which are the children. And that way, the question of who is really responsible for the war is set aside. In 1986 came out sequel Barefoot Gen 2. It is just a continuation of the story. It takes place 3 years after the first film, and it again follows the story of Gen, now dealing with the hardships of living in post-war Japan. Although Grave of the Fireflies cannot be classified as atomic bomb cinema, It bears similarities to Barefoot Gen. The story also draws attention to innocent children during the World War II, depicts a lot of graphic scenes, and is based on an autobiographical novel by Nosaka Akiyuki. The film was produced and directed in 1988 by Isao Takahata, and it tells a story about two little children living alone through the war. Their mother dies during bombings and father serves in the navy, so they are forced to live with their unsympathetic aunt. The older brother Seita decides to leave her house and settles with his young sister Setsuko in an abandoned bomb shelter. This way the story focuses on children as the main victims of the war and doesn't recognize who's actually responsible for it. In this case, it's almost identical to Barefoot Gen. The main contrasting difference is probably the animation style. It feels more mature and polished. It doesn't use manga features like runny noses and streams of tears. Other two anime films that also focus on victimized children are Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind and Akira. They are both set in post-apocalyptic futures, and even though they are not specifically talking about World War II, they reference a nuclear war that took place in the past. In 1980s, the Japanese economy was booming, so every anime film that came out was hitting records of the biggest budget spent. And these two films are no exception. Now, I definitely need to talk about a breakthrough film, which is Godzilla. It was on its initial release in 1954 an absolute hit as the first depiction of nuclear destruction in Japanese cinema. Its masterful director Ishiro Honda paved the way for other monster movies as this sci-fi film introduces a new type of threat. An enormous monster spewing nuclear fire that destroys everything and everyone. At that time, watching the film, it made the Japanese people face the trauma they suffered during World War II in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Since 1954, many sequels and remakes have been made, but the original Gojira remains a classic to this day. Another atomic bomb cinema genre film is Black Rain or Kurayame. This film tells a story of survivors from Hiroshima struggling with PTSD and discrimination against hibakusha. And the last picture I'm going to mention is Rhapsody in August, which was directed by Akira Kurosawa. The story centers on an elderly hibakusha where she learns of a long-forgotten brother, Suzujiro, living in Hawaii, who wants her to visit him before he dies. Families of these two siblings, one Japanese and one American, finally meet and touch the controversial topic of atomic bombing in Nagasaki. The film Hadashi no Gen was produced by a Japanese animation studio Madhouse and directed by Mori Masaki with the help of Keiji Nakazawa. Studio Madhouse often collaborates with other manga artists like Naoki Urasawa or female Japanese manga artist group Clamp. Madhouse has created and helped to produce anime TV series including Aim for the Ace or Death Note and anime films like Wicked City, Ninja Scroll, Paprika, and of course, Barefoot Gen and its sequel Barefoot Gen 2. After its release in 1983, Barefoot Gen in Japan was a success. During the post-war period in Japan, anti-militarism became one of the country's main goals, and this testimony of young surviving hibakusha was aimed at younger generations to familiarize them with the issue of atomic bombing. Their parents and other adults recognized the film as educational and anti-militaristic. It can also be said that Barefoot Gen played a symbolic role in building an image of a peaceful post-war Japan and influenced other war-themed anime films. In the 90s, Barefoot Gen got its dubbed version and was introduced to America. At that time, the rest of the world was familiar with anime. It wouldn't even be an exaggeration if I say that 90s experienced anime craze and that a lot of people started consuming anime. So the film also received success overseas. However, some critics saw Barefoot Gen as pure victimization of Japanese nation without taking any accountability for the war. At the end of the movie, a rumor says that no plant will grow in Hiroshima for 70 years, But Gen and Ryuta find little grass already sprouting through the soil. Even Gen's hair starts to grow back. In a documentary, Keiji Nakazawa mentions that he writes Gen's name with the same Japanese character that is used in the word Genki, meaning healthy or full of life. This takes me back to the beginning of the film where the father tells Gen to grow strong and tough like wheat.
麦はの寒い厳しい冬に芽を出して何回も踏まれ大地にがっしりと根を張り霜や風雪が襲いかかってきても負けんでまっすぐ伸び立派な穂を実らせる。お前たちもこの麦のようにたくましく育って豊かな穂を実らせろよ。
As corny as it is, this message is actually great. And with it, Gen steps into the new beginning where he's going to rebuild the city, take care of the family, and start living anew. Even though the film neglects some important points about the war, I still see the Gen's narrative as educational and as an anti-war statement. In the closing scene, Gen, Ryuta, and their mother release a little boat into the river to commemorate the dead. But it also floats away as a hope for those who survived the attacks. And most importantly, it is a message for next generations to remind them of the true horror of warfare, so it is never to be repeated again.